In a quiet town in Texas, the sound of tools clinking against metal and the faint hum of engines often filled the air around a small garage. Inside worked Ethan Cole, a 43-year-old mechanic whose life was built on simplicity and sincerity. His face carried the marks of years spent working under the sun, and his hands, though worn, moved with the kind of precision only decades of practice could bring. Ethan didn't have much, not a fancy house, not expensive cars, and certainly not wealth. What he did have was an unshakable honesty that earned him the trust of everyone who came his way. Far away in New York City lived Richard Hayes, a man of power and prestige. At 58 years old, Richard was one of the most influential real estate tycoons in America. His skyscrapers pierced the sky. His name was etched into luxury hotels, and his net worth climbed into the billions. Yet for all his power, money, and connections, Richard Hayes was a desperate man. His only daughter, Sophie Hayes, 26 years old, had suffered a terrible fate. A private jet accident had left her spine and legs, severely damaged, taking away her ability to walk. For Richard, who believed there was nothing money couldn't solve, this was the first time in his life he felt powerless. Doctors were flown in from Europe, surgeons from California, specialists from world-class hospitals, but one by one they gave him the same answer. Sophie would never walk again. No amount of wealth could reverse the cruel twist of fate. Sophie's world shrank to the size of a wheelchair, her vibrant life of travel, laughter, and endless dreams collapsing into silent days of frustration and tears. Her friends visited less often, her once bright smile appeared less frequently, and even Richard, a man who had built an empire, could not lift his daughter's spirit. Her mother had passed away years earlier, and now Sophie was alone in her pain, trapped in a body that no longer obeyed her. That summer, Richard decided to take Sophie away from the suffocating walls of New York. He thought a change of scenery might help her spirit, so they traveled quietly to Texas, away from flashing cameras and the gossip of high society. They stayed in a rented ranch house near the outskirts of a small town where the air was clean and the nights were filled with stars. Richard believed the peace might heal something in her heart, if not her body. But fate had already written another plan for them, one that was waiting just around the corner of a dusty Texas road. It happened one afternoon when their black luxury car broke down on a lonely highway. Richard was furious, pacing around, making calls to assistants who were too far away to help. Sophie sat quietly in the back seat, staring at the endless stretch of road, her wheelchair folded beside her. That's when Ethan appeared. His old pickup truck pulled up beside them, and he stepped out wearing his usual dark work shirt, sleeves rolled up, sweat on his brow. He looked nothing like the polished people Sophie was used to, but there was something grounded, something steady in the way he approached. Richard looked at him skeptically, annoyed at the situation, but Ethan didn't flinch. He asked calmly what the problem was and leaned down to check the car. With nothing more than a few old tools, his hands moved with confidence and skill. He didn't need expensive equipment or computer diagnostics, just the knowledge etched into his bones after years of hard work. Sophie watched him from the window, her curiosity growing. This man wasn't rushing, wasn't boasting, and he wasn't intimidated by her father's wealth or anger. He was simply doing what he knew best, fixing what was broken. Within minutes, Ethan had the car running again. Richard offered him money, crisp bills pulled from his wallet, but Ethan shook his head. "Just doing my job, sir," he said simply, wiping his hands on a rag. Richard frowned, unused to having his money, turned away, but Sophie's eyes lingered on Ethan. There was something about the way he carried himself, humble yet strong, quiet yet confident. When Ethan finally looked at her, he didn't glance at her wheelchair. He didn't show pity, nor did he try to look away. Instead, He asked her name. For the first time in months, Sophie felt seen as a person, not as a tragedy. Over the next few days, fate brought them together again. Richard's car seemed to need more than one visit to Ethan's garage, and each time Sophie came along, she found herself drawn to the way Ethan spoke. He didn't tiptoe around her. He didn't shower her with empty encouragements. Instead, he asked about her favorite books, the music she loved, the dreams she had before her. Accident. He cracked jokes, told stories of his childhood in Texas, and made her laugh. Something she hadn't done in what felt like forever. Each laugh felt like a small piece of her old self returning, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Richard noticed the change too, though he didn't fully understand it. To him, Ethan was just a mechanic, an honest man, yes, but not someone who could change the course of his daughter's future. But to Sophie, every conversation with Ethan was a reminder that she was more than her wheelchair, more than her pain. In a world where money had failed her, she found hope in the unlikeliest place in a man who fixed cars with his bare hands, yet somehow was beginning to mend her spirit piece by piece. Over the weeks, Ethan found himself drawn into Sophie's world in ways he had never expected. Every evening, after finishing repairs at the garage, he would sit alone at his old workbench. Instead of engines and transmissions, he now sketched strange blueprints on scraps of paper. He studied hinges, pistons, gears, and hydraulics, reimagining them not for cars, but for something much more meaningful. His calloused hands traced out ideas late into the night, driven by a thought he couldn't shake. What if he could help Sophie walk again? The idea seemed impossible. He was just a mechanic, a man with no medical degree, no laboratory, and no million-dollar equipment. But Ethan had something else: ingenuity, determination, and a heart that refused to accept limits. He remembered watching Sophie's eyes light up when she talked about the life she used to have. He remembered the heaviness in her silence. When she thought no one was looking, it wasn't pity that pushed him, it was hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could return a piece of her stolen freedom. When he finally revealed his plan to Richard Hayes, the billionaire almost laughed in disbelief. "You're a mechanic," Richard said coldly, his voice carrying the sharp edge of impatience. "Do you really think you can succeed where the best doctors and scientists have failed?" Ethan didn't flinch. He simply wiped the grease from his hands and replied, "Sometimes it doesn't take money, Mr. Hayes. Sometimes it just takes heart and a man willing to try." For a moment Richard stared at him, torn between skepticism and the faintest trace of respect. Sophie, however, didn't hesitate. When Ethan showed her his early sketches, clumsy lines on oil-stained paper, she didn't see impossibility. She saw effort. She saw a man who believed in her when no one else dared to. "I want to help," she said firmly, surprising even her father, and so began their unlikely partnership. Every day, Sophie wheeled herself into the garage, tying her hair back and rolling up her sleeves. Soon, her soft hands bore smudges of grease, her nails chipped from working beside Ethan. They tested scraps of metal, measured gears, and welded joints together under the golden glow of flickering workshop lamps. For Sophie, it wasn't just about the invention, it was about rediscovering herself. Each time she held a wrench or steadied a part for Ethan, she felt alive. Again, she wasn't a patient trapped in a wheelchair. She was a builder, a dreamer, part of something greater. The garage, once filled only with the smell of oil and engines, now echoed with her laughter and determination. Richard often stood at a distance, watching with conflicted eyes. He didn't want to crush Sophie's spirit, but he also didn't dare believe in false hope. To him, Ethan's contraption looked like a pile of metal parts stitched together by optimism. Yet every evening when Sophie returned home with her face glowing, Richard noticed something extraordinary. She was no longer the quiet, broken girl. She was coming alive again, fueled by purpose, and that alone was a miracle. Piece by piece, Ethan's invention began to take shape. The skeletal frame of metal, supported by hydraulic joints, stood like a silent guardian in the corner of the garage. Wires ran through the design like veins, gears clicked with quiet promise, and belts tightened around joints with mechanical precision. Ethan worked tirelessly, sacrificing sleep, food, and even repair jobs just to get it right. Sophie, too, poured her heart into the project, helping wherever she could. Together, they were not building a machine, they were building hope. Weeks of work turned into months of refinement. They tested and failed, adjusted and rebuilt. Sometimes the frame collapsed under weight, sometimes the gears jammed, sometimes sparks flew, dangerously close. But every failure only strengthened their resolve. One night, after a particularly frustrating breakdown, Sophie found Ethan sitting quietly on the garage floor, his head in his hands. "Maybe I was foolish to think this could work," he murmured. Sophie wheeled closer, her voice steady. "You're not foolish. You're the only one who hasn't given up on me." Her words reignited the fire in him. And then, one unforgettable evening, the moment finally arrived. The device stood completed, polished with care, its steel parts gleaming under the dim light of the workshop. Ethan had poured every ounce of knowledge into it, his welding, his engineering, his mechanic's intuition. Sophie stared at it nervously, her heart pounding. Ethan knelt beside her, adjusting the straps, his voice calm but filled with quiet excitement. "Ready?" he asked. Sophie swallowed hard, nodding. With trembling hands, she strapped herself into the contraption that might change her life forever. The first attempt was shaky. Sophie's legs trembled as the machine hummed to life, supporting her weight. Ethan steadied her, his hands gentle yet firm on the frame. Slowly, the hydraulics engaged, lifting her body upward. Sophie gasped, her eyes widening as her feet touched the ground and she rose higher. Her balance wavered, her breath quickened, but for the first time in nearly 2 years, she was standing. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she whispered through trembling lips, "I'm standing." The sound of those words filled the garage like music. Ethan's heart swelled, but he said nothing, letting Sophie have her moment. Richard, who had been silently watching from the doorway, felt his chest tighten, his throat ache with unspoken emotion. His daughter was on her feet, not because of hospitals or money, but because of a small-town mechanic who refused to give up. Sophie's hands gripped the frame, her knees shaking, but Ethan encouraged her gently, step by step. And then, like a miracle unfolding, Sophie moved her right leg forward, then her left. Small, shaky steps, but steps nonetheless. The garage seemed to hold its breath. Sophie's sobs turned into laughter, broken yet beautiful, as she looked down at her feet moving. "I'm walking," she whispered, disbelief and joy colliding in her voice. Ethan smiled quietly, his rugged face soft with pride. He didn't boast, didn't claim credit. He simply walked beside her, making sure she didn't fall. To him, the victory wasn't his invention. It was Sophie's courage, her determination to rise after so much pain. In that moment, money, status, and titles melted away. The billionaire's daughter and the small-town mechanic stood side by side, united by resilience, trust, and heart. Richard, for all his wealth, realized he was witnessing something priceless, a miracle money could never buy. For Sophie, every shaky step was a declaration that she was not broken, that life still had meaning, that hope was real. And for Ethan, it was proof. That sometimes the greatest victories weren't found under the hood of a car, but in helping someone stand again. As the night stretched on, Sophie walked a few more steps, each one steadier than the last. The garage filled with laughter, tears, and the quiet hum of the machine that had given her a second chance. Ethan looked at Sophie, her eyes glowing with determination, and knew this was only the beginning. The girl who had once thought her life was over was walking again, not just because of an invention, but because someone had believed in her when the world had given up. The news of Sophie's Recovery spread through New York like a spark catching dry wood. People whispered about the billionaire's daughter who could now stand and walk again, not because of the finest hospitals or the most expensive doctors, but because of a humble Texas mechanic with oil-stained hands. When the press first broke the story, skeptics assumed it was exaggerated, just another publicity stunt to polish the Hayes family's image. But when Sophie appeared publicly for the first time, all doubts melted away, and the world leaned in to listen. Months later, Richard Hayes organized a grand charity gala in New York City, intending to raise money for spinal injury research. It was supposed to be a glittering event of wealth and philanthropy, filled with donors, celebrities, and politicians. No one expected it to become the stage for one of the most unforgettable moments of Sophie's life. The lights dimmed, music swelled, and all eyes turned as Sophie, dressed in a simple but elegant gown, slowly walked across the stage. Gasps filled the air, followed by silence. The device Ethan had built supported her legs with quiet precision, every step careful but sure. Sophie's face glowed, not from wealth or glamour, but from the raw strength of someone who had fought her way back from despair. The audience, stunned, rose to their feet in thunderous applause. People cried openly, strangers clasped hands, and cameras flashed wildly. They weren't clapping for her father's billions, but for the courage of a young woman and the quiet genius of a man who had refused to give up. Richard Hayes, normally a man of pride and power, found his throat tightening as he watched. His eyes burned with tears he didn't bother to hide. When Sophie reached the microphone, she paused, breathing heavily, her hands steady on the podium. The crowd held its breath as she began to speak. "I once believed my life had ended," she said softly, her voice breaking. "But I was wrong. Sometimes hope comes from the most unexpected places." The gala that night raised millions. But what lingered most wasn't the money. It was the image of a father, once consumed by his wealth, walking onto the stage and shaking the hand of a mechanic who had given him something no amount of fortune could purchase. "I have spent billions," Richard Hayes said into the microphone, his voice trembling, "but I could never buy what you've given my daughter." Cameras captured that handshake, the billionaire bowing his head in gratitude to a grease-covered man from Texas. For Ethan, the moment was overwhelming. He had never seen himself as a hero, just someone who liked fixing what was broken, yet standing in front of flashing cameras next to Sophie, whose life had been transformed. He realized this was bigger than anything he had ever dreamed. When Sophie looked at him with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Thank you," Ethan felt more pride than any paycheck could ever bring. In that moment, he knew his work wasn't finished. After the gala, offers poured in. Universities called, research labs sent letters, and investors begged Ethan to sell his designs. But Ethan refused to let greed corrupt his mission. Sitting across from Sophie one night in the quiet of his workshop, he said, "I didn't build this to make money. I built it because you needed it, and there are thousands more like you who need it too." Sophie nodded, her eyes lighting up. That was when the idea for their foundation was born. Together, they created a non-profit dedicated to building affordable mobility devices for children and adults across America. Unlike the medical giants who charge fortunes, Ethan and Sophie's foundation promised accessibility, innovation, and above all, hope. Factories that once manufactured car parts shifted to producing lightweight frames. Volunteers, many of them veterans and engineers, joined the cause, drawn not by salaries but by purpose. The workshop in Texas became a hub of invention and kindness. Families from all over the country began arriving. Children who had never stood before now walked toward their parents' open arms. Veterans who thought their independence was gone forever found themselves standing tall once more. Each story added fuel to Ethan's determination and Sophie's mission. They weren't just fixing broken bodies, they were restoring dignity, joy, and the belief that life after tragedy was still worth living. News stations called it a miracle movement. But Ethan always shook his head. "It's not a miracle," he said. "It's people refusing to give up on each other." At one press conference, a journalist asked Sophie why she trusted Ethan so much, when the best doctors in the world had failed her. Sophie smiled, replied, "Because he never looked at me like a billionaire's daughter or a broken girl. He saw me, just me, and that's all I ever needed." Her words went viral, replayed on television, quoted in newspapers, and shared on social media. Millions were inspired by her courage and by Ethan's unwavering humility. Despite their growing recognition, Ethan remained the same man he had always been. He still wore his old work shirts, still spent long nights tinkering with gears and circuits in his garage, and still insisted on testing every device himself. Sophie often sat beside him, laughing, sometimes covered in grease herself. They weren't just partners in invention, they were partners in life's hardest battles, and together they were unstoppable. The foundation expanded to multiple states, but Sophie and Ethan never forgot their roots. Every month they returned to Texas, holding community events at the very garage where it had all begun. Local kids painted murals of superheroes, except these heroes wore overalls and held wrenches instead of capes. Families brought food, volunteers sang, and the small town that had once been quiet now thrummed with purpose. The world came to see not just a garage, but a place where broken things and broken people could be made whole again. Years later, when asked about her journey, Sophie always told the same story. She spoke of the accident, the despair, and the endless doctors who gave her no hope. But she always ended with the same words: "I lost my ability to walk in a single moment. But I found my strength again in the hands of someone who saw me not as a billionaire's daughter, but just as me." Those words became the motto of their foundation, etched into every device they gave away. For Ethan, life had never been about wealth or recognition. Yet standing side by side with Sophie, watching thousands of lives transformed, he finally understood the quiet power of what they had created. He had fixed engines all his life, but this time he had fixed something far greater, the human spirit. And for Sophie, every step she took reminded her not of what she had lost, but of what she had found: hope, purpose, and the kindness of a mechanic who had changed her life forever.